Welcome back from lunch, or welcome for those of you who are coming just for the afternoon session. I'm Amy Myers-Jaffe. I am the director of the Baker Institute Energy Forum, and we are delighted to be able to put this program together with our co-partner Robin West and PFC Energy. It is a great honor now to introduce our midday keynote speaker, Director Michael Bromwich, from the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, Regulation, and Enforcement. Director Bromwich is overseeing the restructuring of the Bureau, which you all know is responsible for oil and gas development on the continental shelf. He has a very distinguished past. He is probably one of our country's foremost experts on internal investigation, compliance, and monitoring, having been an independent monitor for the DC Metropolitan Police, and moving on to many different positions, Associate Counsel in the Office of Independent Counsel for Iran-Contra, as well as the Assistant U.S. Attorney in New York. He is a distinguished jurist, publishing articles in various law reviews and publications, and we are very pleased to have him with us here today to talk about the path forward, as has been our theme for the morning. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Amy, for that kind and generous introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me to participate in today's Energy Forum. It's a pleasure to be here with you today to discuss the groundbreaking changes that are taking place for oil and gas drilling and development in the waters off our country's shores. These changes are, for the most part, long overdue, and as is so often the case when it comes to serious reform in any field, were driven by a major catastrophe. In this case, the unprecedented deepwater blowout of the Macondo well, the sinking of the Deepwater Horizon drilling rig, the tragic deaths of 11 workers, and a spill of nearly 5 million barrels of oil into the waters of the Gulf of Mexico. The Deepwater Horizon tragedy immediately roused both government and industry out of a complacency that had developed over the past several decades. The result of that complacency was that the increased dangers of deepwater drilling were not matched by increased vigilance and concern for the safety of those operations. Today, I want to share with you the steps that our agency is taking to renew its commitment to the responsible stewardship of our nation's resources on the Outer Continental Shelf. I'll also discuss the reforms that are necessary both in government and in the oil and gas industry to ensure that this activity, which is plainly vital to our economy and our security, is conducted safely. Now, it's been almost 8 months since I became the director of the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, Regulation, and Enforcement. BOEMR, and I gather somebody had some trouble pronouncing it, it's BOEMR, just so everyone's clear, was created by Secretary of the Interior Ken Salazar less than 2 months after the Deepwater Horizon accident to replace the former Minerals Management Service. The mandate that I received from President Obama and Secretary Salazar was broad, it was ambitious, and it was urgent to reform offshore energy development, starting with the agency responsible for overseeing it. Since that time, we have been working hard to make the changes that are necessary to restore the public's confidence that offshore oil and gas drilling and production can be and will be conducted safely and with appropriate protections for marine and coastal environments. My remarks today will address the changes that have occurred and are ongoing in the oversight of offshore oil and gas operations. This topic, of course, could not be more timely. Here in Houston, there are many operators and support companies anxious to resume drilling activity as soon as possible. During the course of the past 8 months, I have met with representatives of these companies, many of whom I see here today, individually and in groups. Some of these companies seem to recognize that Deepwater Horizon was the symptom of a broader failure in both industry and government, a failure to ensure that advances in drilling and workplace safety kept pace with increasingly risky operations, and that the industry regulator had the tools and resources to do its job. But there are other operators who have seemed all too ready to shrug off Deepwater Horizon as a complete aberration, a perfect storm, a one in a million. They point to the lack of a similar blowout in the decades before the explosion and spill, and suggest that the steps taken in response have been an overreaction and were unnecessary. Needless to say, that is disappointing and, in my view, short-sighted. Let me state the obvious: we reject that view. Our view has been supported most recently by the report issued by the National Commission on the BP Deepwater Horizon oil spill and offshore drilling, and I know you heard from Shirley Neff, one of the senior staffers from the Commission. If you have not read the Commission's report, I encourage you to do so. I was rereading the recommendations on the plane this morning. It is a thoughtful and comprehensive analysis of not only the spill itself, but of the history and development of offshore drilling and of the regulation of offshore drilling. As the Commission describes in its report, regulatory and industry reform in the wake of a significant offshore disaster has happened before. The UK and Norway substantially changed their oversight of offshore drilling and production following the Piper Alpha and Alexander Keeland incidents. Australia is currently facing many of the same issues we are confronting following the Montara blowout, which occurred only 8 months before Deepwater Horizon. Now, the specific challenges facing us are unique in many significant respects. The scale of offshore oil and gas operations in U.S. waters, particularly in the Gulf of Mexico, is vastly greater than those in the North Sea. The economies of many of the Gulf Coast states are closely tied to offshore industry. The Gulf accounts for more than 25% of domestic oil production and approximately 12% of domestic natural gas production. Now, one of the key problems that we are addressing and that simply can't be avoided is this: how will government and industry make the fundamental reforms necessary to improve the safety and environmental protection in this massive industry, while at the same time allowing for the continuity of operations and production? To illustrate the problem, consider this. UK offshore production, which again is at a much smaller level than the Gulf, dropped off substantially for 2 years following the Piper Alpha incident, almost came to a standstill. Now, as I mentioned a moment ago, there are some in the oil and gas industry that dismiss Macondo as an isolated event that does not represent a broader problem. But evidence developed by the President's Commission convincingly refutes the notion that Deepwater Horizon was a one-in-a-million event. They identify in their report 79 loss of well control accidents in the Gulf between 1996 and 2009. That's 79, not one in a million. The Commission had tough criticism for both industry and federal regulators, and although we at BOMR have been hard at work addressing the issues they raise, I think it's important to spend a minute to focus on where we were on April 20th. The Commission specifically notes significant failures and needed changes in industry safety and environmental practices, safety training, drilling technology, containment and cleanup technology, preparedness, corporate culture, and management behavior. One of the Commission's central regulatory recommendations is that the oil and gas industry should establish an entity similar to the Institute of Nuclear Power Operations, or INPO, which would be an industry-sponsored entity aimed at developing, adopting, and enforcing standards of excellence to ensure continuous improvement in safety and operational integrity offshore. We believe this recommendation is worthy of serious discussion and debate. We view such a structure as potentially complementary to the critical reforms and improvements we have undertaken, rather than a substitute. And we're interested to see what industry does to move forward with this suggestion. Now, the Commission was critical of industry, but it was equally, if not more, critical of federal regulators, including the former MMS. The Commission found that federal oversight was compromised by combining separate and conflicting missions within one agency, namely the responsibility for promoting the expansion of offshore leasing and drilling, and the responsibility for ensuring safety and protecting the environment. Regulators simply failed to keep pace with the dramatic transformation of the offshore drilling industry and the move to deeper water drilling. Neither inspectors on the front lines nor senior agency officials had the tools or the training to fully oversee deepwater offshore drilling. In short, both industry and government were unprepared to contain a deepwater well blowout. And then there is the issue that I believe played a key role in the disaster. MMS did not receive predictable and adequate funding needed to effectively oversee offshore drilling. Over the past 20 years, the MMS budget for leasing, environmental protection, and regulatory oversight remained stagnant, while deepwater drilling in the Gulf of Mexico expanded dramatically. Now, we've been working to address many of the issues the President's Commission addresses in its report. Let me be specific about what we've already done and what we plan to do in the future. Together with Secretary Salazar, we've undertaken the most aggressive and comprehensive reform of offshore oil and gas regulation and oversight in U.S. history. This includes the reorganization of the former MMS to establish mission clarity and to strengthen oversight. And it also includes the development and implementation of heightened standards for drilling practices, safety equipment, and environmental safeguards. These new rules set forth prescriptive standards that industry must meet, but they also establish for the first time in the U.S. offshore regulatory system performance-based standards focused on the identification and mitigation of specific risks associated with offshore operations. These changes are substantial, and a great deal of work is being done to ensure that these changes are both lasting and effective. The ultimate goal is to establish an industry-wide culture of safety and to have well-equipped and professional regulators. Both elements are necessary to keep pace with the challenges and risks of offshore drilling, particularly as those operations push into new frontiers and face increased technical challenges. Let me outline for you the main elements of our fundamental reorganization and reform of the former MMS. As we have previously announced, in the place of the former MMS and in the place of BOMR, the direct and temporary descendant of MMS, we are creating 3 strong independent agencies with clearly defined roles and missions. MMS, with its conflicting missions of promoting resource development, enforcing safety regulations, maximizing revenues from offshore operations, and lack of resources, could not keep pace with the challenges of overseeing industry operating in U.S. waters. The reorganization of the former MMS is designed to remove those conflicts by clarifying and separating missions across 3 agencies and providing each of the new agencies with clear missions and new resources necessary to fulfill those missions. We are designing and implementing these organizational changes while we fully take into account the crucial need for information sharing and the other links and connections among the functions of the former MMS. This is essential to ensure that the regulatory processes related to offshore leasing, plan approval, and permitting do not succumb to bureaucratic paralysis. On October 1 of last year, the revenue collection arm of the former MMS became the Office of Natural Resources Revenue, and now is located in a different part of the Interior Department with reporting structure and chain of command completely separate from the offshore regulator. The President's Commission agrees with this change. Over the coming months, the offshore resource management and enforcement programs will be established as separate, independent organizations. The next steps in the reorganization are more difficult, but also extremely important. They involve separating the energy development functions from the safety and environmental enforcement missions of the nation's offshore regulator. The Interior Department, as well as the President's Commission, has concluded that the separation of these missions is essential to reforming the government's oversight of offshore energy development. I want to discuss with you some of the details of the 2 new independent agencies, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, or BOEM, and the Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement, or BSEE. This reorganization is much more than just moving boxes around on an organization chart. It is about making fundamental, thoughtful changes in the way these agencies operate. The new Bureau of Ocean Energy Management will be responsible for managing development of the nation's offshore resources. This involves ensuring that the environment is protected and that the nation's offshore energy resources, including oil, gas, and renewable resources, are developed wisely, economically, and in the country's best interests. The new Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement will independently and rigorously enforce safety and environmental regulations. Over the past many months, we have been engaged in a comprehensive and rigorous analysis to ensure that we address the structural issues and conflict of interest problems that existed in the former MMS, and to plan for the orderly commencement of the new bureaus. We have worked with and received advice from leading experts in government transformations, and we have examined closely the offshore regulatory regimes of other nations, including the UK and Norway. We also have considered and will continue to bear in mind the recommendations of the President's Commission, which has obviously done its own analysis of these issues. One of the important steps in our planning and analysis has been to ensure that we can implement these changes while minimizing disruptions to the Bureau's daily operations. We did this by discussing the reorganization with employees throughout the agency. We received their input, collected and analyzed data relating to the Bureau's processes, systems, and regulatory metrics, and developed a number of alternative models and options for restructuring and reforming the Bureau. This work has been time-consuming, it's been painstaking, but it has been essential to making informed decisions regarding the transformation of the current Bureau. Now, I want to highlight a couple of the more significant changes we are making, which promote the principles of independence, development of rigorous and thorough science, and safety and environmental protection. We're separating resource management from safety oversight to allow permitting engineers and inspectors whose job is central to overseeing safe operations, greater independence, more budgetary autonomy, and clearer missions and leadership focus than they've had in the past. Our goal is to create a tough-minded but fair regulator that can effectively keep pace with the risks of offshore drilling and will promote the development of safety cultures in offshore operators. We're providing a structure that ensures that sound environmental reviews are conducted and that the potential environmental effects of proposed operations are given appropriate weight during decision-making related to resource management. This is to ensure that leasing and plan approval activities are properly balanced. These processes must be both rigorous and efficient so that operations can go forward promptly and with full understanding of their potential environmental effects, and with confidence that appropriate mitigation against those potential environmental effects are in place. We're strengthening the role of environmental review and analysis in both organizations through various structural and organizational mechanisms. Those include, first, the creation of a first-ever Chief Environmental Officer in BOEM. This person will be responsible for ensuring that environmental concerns are appropriately balanced in leasing and planning decisions and for helping set the scientific agenda relative to our oceans. This is a new, high-profile, and extremely important position which we hope and expect will attract top-flight talent. We are also separating the environmental review and leasing programs in BOEM's regional offices. We're creating a new plan approval process in BOEM. We're developing for the first time a new environmental compliance and enforcement function, which will reside in BSEE. And finally, we're establishing as a national level priority the review and enforcement of oil spill response plans, which will be conducted in BSEE. Now, as we move forward with implementing these changes, we will continue to take the Commission's recommendations into account in designing the final structure and our interactions between these two new agencies within the Department of the Interior. Let me next discuss the important substantive work in addition to the reorganization that's going on to provide the tools, the training, and the other changes to the culture to make sure that the reorganization will have the results that we're aiming for. As part of our broad and continuing reform efforts, we have created a number of implementation teams that have been hard at work for several months. They are the central focus of our efforts to analyze critical aspects of the way we're structured, our functions, our processes, and to implement our reform agenda. These teams are integral to our reorganization effort, and they are considering the various recommendations for improvement that have come from a large variety of sources over the last 8 months, including the President's Commission, the National Academy of Engineering, the Safety Oversight Board commissioned by Secretary Salazar, and the Department of Interior Inspector General. If it's one thing we haven't been short of, it's critical reports about the agency. These teams, these implementation teams, are laying the foundation for lasting change to the way we currently do business and the way that these successor agencies, BOEM and BSEE, will do business in the future. I want to take a moment to briefly describe the key areas and issues that these teams are working on, and I will just tick them off rather than give you more detailed explanations. We're looking at permitting. We're looking at various aspects of inspections. We're looking at our entire regulatory enforcement program, including the adequacy of the enforcement tools we have available to us. We're looking, as I mentioned a moment ago, at environmental compliance and enforcement and looking at the challenges of designing the kind of environmental enforcement program we've never had before. We're looking at incident investigations, how we conduct them and how we can better conduct them. And we're looking, as I mentioned a moment ago, at oil spill response, conducting a comprehensive review of the adequacy of our efforts historically to make sure that operators' oil spill response plans are adequately. We're working closely with the Coast Guard, among others, on that. As you can tell just from my ticking off very quickly those implementation teams and what they're looking at, you can tell that the effort is broad, it's ambitious. These teams have really become the chief engine of our reform efforts. In addition to the important work that these teams are doing, I want to briefly mention a number of other significant internal reforms we have put into place. We're in the midst of reviewing our application of NEPA, including in particular the use of categorical exclusions. We have obtained public comments on our NEPA policy, and we are in the process of reviewing and analyzing the comments we've received. We're working closely with the Council on Environmental Quality on this evaluation. In the meantime, we are requiring that site-specific environmental assessments, as opposed to the categorical exclusion reviews performed in the past, be conducted for all new and revised exploration and development plans in deep water. To address conflicts of interest, which had never been adequately addressed in the agency before, we've issued a tough new recusal policy that will reduce the potential for real or perceived conflicts of interest. Employees in our district offices must notify their supervisors about any potential conflict of interest, and they must request to be recused from performing any official duty in which such a conflict exists. Thus, our inspectors are required to recuse themselves from performing inspections of the facilities of former employers. Also, our inspectors must report any attempt by industry or by other BOEMer personnel to inappropriately influence, pressure, or interfere with their official duties. Soon, we will be issuing a broader version of the policy that applies these ethical standards across the agency. Now, I know that these policies will prevent some operational challenges for some of our district offices in the Gulf, which are located in small communities where the primary employers are offshore companies. But the need for tough rules defining the boundaries between regulators and the regulated is both necessary, compelling, and long overdue. These rules are necessary to assure the public that our inspections and enforcement programs are effective, aggressive, and that they're independent. Finally, we're staffing up our new Investigations and Review Unit, a unit I created immediately on taking over the agency. This unit, which is composed of professionals with law enforcement backgrounds or technical expertise, has several important missions. First, it will promptly and credibly respond to allegations or evidence of misconduct and unethical behavior by Bureau employees. Second, it will pursue allegations of misconduct against oil and gas companies involved in offshore energy projects. And third, it will provide the Bureau with the ability to respond swiftly to emerging issues and crises, including significant incidents such as spills and accidents. All of these measures, I contend, will help us ensure the rigorous and independent oversight of offshore drilling. Now, I've discussed many of the reforms that we're pursuing to improve the effectiveness of government oversight of offshore energy development and drilling. These changes are both substantial and necessary. But as the President's Commission, among others, has made abundantly clear, industry must change as well. Some of this work must be done by the industry alone, but my agency has a clear and important role in helping to spur that change. We are playing that role through the issuance of new prescriptive regulations to bolster safety and to enhance the evaluation and mitigation of environmental risks. We have raised the bar already quite substantially for equipment, safety, and environmental safeguards in the drilling and production stages of offshore operations. and we will continue to do so in an open and transparent way in the coming months and years. We have also introduced for the first time performance-based standards similar to those used by regulators in the North Sea. We have done all of this through the development and implementation of 2 new rules, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with, that we announced last fall and that raise standards for the oil and gas industry's operations on the OCS. The first rule, the drilling safety rule, is an emergency rule prompted by Deepwater Horizon that has put in place tough new standards for well design, casing, and cementing, and well control equipment, including blowout preventers. For the first time, operators are now required to obtain independent third-party inspection and certification of each stage of the proposed drilling process. In addition, an engineer must certify that blowout preventers meet new standards for testing and maintenance and are capable of severing the drill pipe under anticipated well pressures. The second rule we implemented is the workplace safety rule, which aims to reduce the human and organizational errors that lie at the heart of many accidents and oil spills. The development of this rule was in process well before Deepwater Horizon, but as described in the Commission's report, the promulgation of these performance-based standards was frustrated for a variety of reasons for a very long time. Unfortunately, as was the case in other countries such as the UK and Norway, it apparently took a major accident to provide the impetus necessary for these standards to be imposed. Operators now are required to develop a comprehensive safety and environmental management program that identifies the potential hazards and risk reduction strategies for all phases of activity, from well design and construction to operation and maintenance, and finally to the decommissioning of platforms. Although many companies, I'm well aware, had developed such SEM systems on a voluntary basis in the past, many had not. And our reviews had demonstrated, somewhat surprisingly, that the percentage of offshore operators that had adopted such programs voluntarily was declining. In addition to the new rules, we have issued what we call Notice to Lessees, or NTLs, as many of you know. These provide additional guidance to operators on complying with existing regulations. In June, we issued NTL 6, which requires that operators' oil spill response plans include a well-specific blowout and worst-case discharge scenario, and that operators also provide the assumptions and calculations behind those scenarios. In November, we issued NTL 10, a document that establishes informational requirements, including a corporate statement from the operator that will conduct the applied-for drilling operation in compliance with all applicable agency regulations, including the new drilling safety rule. The NTL also confirms that we will be evaluating whether each operator has submitted adequate information to demonstrate that it has access to and can deploy subsea containment resources that would be sufficient to promptly respond to a deepwater blowout or other loss of well control. This information will help us evaluate operators' compliance with current spill response regulations. This containment issue, which has attracted a great deal of attention, especially in recent weeks, is the principal issue that has delayed our ability to issue deepwater permits. The fact is that although industry has been working hard, it has not yet been able to fully demonstrate that it has the equipment and systems in place to respond to a blowout in deep water. It would simply be irresponsible to approve new deepwater drilling before we have an answer to the simple but compelling question, what if there was a blowout? How would you control it? How would you deal with it so it doesn't produce a massive spill that pollutes the Gulf and soils its beaches? Now, industry and BOMR have been working aggressively and productively, I think, to answer that question. And substantial progress has been made, some of it quite recently. I've been personally involved in many of those meetings. Progress continues to be made, and I am confident that this capacity will be demonstrated soon. But moving forward without this critical piece of protection would be irresponsible in light of the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. Now, regulatory changes have been rapid, including the ones I've just described, and there have been, understandably, questions from industry and others about our new regulations, about the NTLs, about how we will apply NEPA going forward with respect to deepwater drilling operations. We've held literally dozens of meetings, both in the Gulf and in Washington, with federal and state representatives, industry groups, non-governmental organizations, and individual operators to answer questions about the new rules and to provide clarity about the post-Deepwater Horizon regulatory environment. We have also issued a comprehensive guidance document which provides a comprehensive and detailed outline of the way forward for permitting in deep water. We have discussed the contents of the guidance with a number of companies and have received valuable input on the guidance from them and from industry as a whole. We know that the guidance that we've already issued will not resolve every question that an operator may have about the deep water permitting process as it applies to an individual application. But we intended it to address the significant questions that we have heard and to provide answers to help operators move forward with the resumption of work in deep water. The fact that continuing guidance has been necessary is completely unsurprising. With the volume of new rules and formal guidance we have issued in recent months, the need for additional clarification was inevitable and it was necessary. It reflects no more than these are complex issues to work through, which is exactly what we've been doing. Now, we hope and trust that this guidance has substantially clarified most of the difficult and complex issues that have arisen in recent months. We are absolutely and firmly committed to continuing to work with industry to provide additional guidance on these and other issues as that becomes necessary. We are working hard to ensure that this very important industry continues to be able to operate fully and successfully, and we continue to believe deepwater drilling will be approved in the near future. That said, one thing the Secretary Salazar and I believe is that a retreat on drilling safety is simply not an option. Now, as you can hear from my description, we've already put in place significant pieces of our comprehensive reform agenda, but our work is far from over. The technology associated with offshore drilling will continue to evolve, as many of you know in greater detail than I do, as will the complexities and the risks of those operations, particularly in frontier environments such as ultra-deep water and the Arctic. We will proceed through the standard notice and comment rulemaking process to implement further safety measures down the road, including features of the next generation of subsea containment equipment such as blowout preventers and remotely operated vehicles. As we've already said, the Bureau will also promulgate additional workplace safety reforms through the rulemaking process, including requirements for independent third-party verification of operators' SEMS programs. We also will continue to evaluate the regulatory standards used by other countries to ensure that the standards that we're applying in U.S. waters, as well as the agency that enforces those standards, are world-class. These are among the issues discussed in the Commission's report, and the Commission provides very useful insights about those issues. Now, over the past several months, especially since our new rules were announced at the end of September, we have heard from countless companies, trade associations, and members of Congress about the significant anxiety that exists in the industry that we will soon change the rules of the permitting process significantly, thereby creating yet additional uncertainty about what is required to conduct business on the Outer Continental Shelf. The phrases that we've heard repeatedly are changing the rules, moving the goalposts. The implication is that we have other regulatory requirements up our sleeve that we've not yet disclosed. This is not the case. Barring significant and unanticipated revelations from investigations into the root causes of the Deepwater Horizon explosion that remain in process, I do not anticipate further emergency rulemakings, period. At the same time, we can no longer accept the view that the appropriate response to a rapidly evolving, developing, and changing industry which employs increasingly sophisticated technologies is for the regulatory framework and the applicable rules to remain frozen in time. Over time, the regulatory framework and the specific requirements must keep pace with advances in the industry and with industry ambitions to drill in deeper water in geological formations that have greater pressures. We will continue to analyze information that becomes available, and we will implement reforms necessary to make offshore oil and gas production safer, smarter, and with stronger protections for workers and for the environment. Now, in developing these reforms, we will balance the need for regulatory certainty, whose importance we well recognize, against the need to act on new insights and adapt to changing technology. And importantly, the processing of drilling permit applications and proposed drilling plans will not be delayed while these additional reforms are developed. You know as well as I do that we can always do better, and that we must always remain open to improvements in our regulations to develop the necessary culture of safety. In the past, industry has in many instances reflexively opposed new regulations. That is no more responsible, in my judgment, than the mindless multiplication of new requirements for their own sake. We must strike a new balance that fully involves industry in the regulatory process, but that recognizes the need for us to exercise independent judgment. Our challenge in the months and years ahead is to ensure that we do not once again become overconfident and complacent, but rather that we continue to make progress in developing state-of-the-art safety, containment, and response capabilities. Government, industry, and the best minds in our universities must collaborate on ongoing research and development to create cutting-edge technologies in areas such as well-conditioned sensor capabilities and remote BOP activation, among others. This is why we have established a new Offshore Energy Safety Advisory Committee headed by Dr. Tom Hunter, which will include federal agencies, industry, academia, national labs, and various research organizations. The 15-member committee will work on a variety of issues related to offshore energy safety, including drilling and workplace safety, well intervention, and containment and oil spill response. This will be a key component of a long-term strategy to address on an ongoing basis the technological needs and inherent risks associated with offshore drilling and deepwater drilling in particular. I have made a large number of contacts, including to companies represented in this room, this week alone, with the academic world, with the NGO world, and with industry, just over the last few days to ensure that we have an outstanding committee. As you know, Secretary Salazar has asked Dr. Hunter, the former head of the Sandia National Lab, to chair that committee. The Ocean Energy Institute, which will be nurtured and shaped by the advisory committee, will foster collaboration among all key stakeholders to increase offshore energy safety. The Institute will focus on a broad range of matters related to safety, including drilling and workplace safety, well intervention, and spill response. It will also help to spur collaborative research and development, training, and execution in these and other areas relating to safety. Among the Institute's objectives will be developing a collaborative research and development strategy, recommending research to develop advanced drilling technology, testing and implementation protocols, understanding full system risk and reliability analyses for the offshore environment, and developing an enduring research and development capability and a knowledge base useful both for preventing and responding to accidents. Most importantly, this institute is a key component of a long-term strategy to address on an ongoing basis the technological needs and inherent risks associated with offshore drilling and deepwater drilling in particular. A final but very important part of our long-term strategy includes continuing our collaboration with our international counterparts. The Commission's recommendations stress the importance of sharing experiences across different international systems and in establishing global standards and best practices. We agree with that. The U.S. regulator can and should play a leading role in establishing those standards and elevating the safety of offshore operations not only in the U.S. but around the world. We have already taken positive steps in this direction in recent months. We are one of the founding members of the International Regulators Forum and work closely with our counterparts in that institutional context. This summer, we hosted a special meeting of the IRF in Herndon, Virginia, to share our experiences on drilling safety. We're also a substantial player in the Department of State's Energy Governance and Capacity Initiative, which is a multi-agency global effort to provide a range of technical and capacity building assistance to government and institutions of specific countries that are expected to become emerging oil and gas producers. We've also increased our bilateral outreach to our foreign counterparts. In October, I delivered a keynote speech at the IRF conference in Vancouver, Canada. Prior to the conference, I met with my counterparts from Norway, the UK, Canada, and Australia. Later this month, I will be meeting with foreign officials from both Australia and the UK to discuss our offshore regulatory programs and theirs. Going forward, it's my hope that we will continue to collaborate with our foreign counterparts in developing safer, more environmentally responsible drilling on the OCS. If I've learned nothing else in the close to 8 months I've been on this job, I've learned that passions run deep with respect to offshore energy exploration. I'm committed to continuing the dialogue with industry, environmental organizations, and other stakeholders to improve the safety of offshore energy operations and to help strike the appropriate balance among the many legitimate concerns and interests that lie at the heart of offshore energy. I want to thank you very much for your time and attention, and now I very much look forward to answering any questions you may have.
Yes, sir. I much appreciate your comments. Right towards the end, when you mentioned the international interactions and what have you, I noticed you didn't mention Mexico or Cuba. Is there a reason for this?
No, there's not a reason for that at all, and I think you point to a key and important point, which is that we share the Gulf of Mexico with Mexico and with Cuba. And so I think we will need to work on trying to do what we can to establish common standards so that operators can operate in the waters that respectively belong to those three countries. We have had some very productive meetings both in the IRF context and separately with the government of Mexico. We're working on trying to figure out what the proper and appropriate approach is to Cuba. But you're quite right in pointing out that those are two very important companies that need to be engaged in some fashion in the international effort.
Other questions?
You've been quoted as saying that the chances of returning to former levels of leasing activity or permitting activity were never. Would you like to explain or at least elucidate on that comment?
I've not said that about leasing activity,
okay.
So if that was attributed to me, they got it wrong. I have said that about permitting activities because simply the number of additional requirements that we have and the additional environmental work that we're going to have to do on many exploratory plans and additional reviews on applications to drill mean that we're not going to be able to process permits in as rapid fire a way as we did before. I think the perception in the external world was for many years that we were a permitting mill. And although I think that may be an unfair characterization, the fact is that we churned out permits very quickly, in some cases without adequate environmental reviews and analysis. So that's what's going to cause, I think, a somewhat slower process of approving permits than has been the case in the past. One of the things I want to address in response to your question is the notion that there are a large number of backlogged permit applications that we have. I know the operators here know that that's not so. We have 9 shallow water permit applications that are pending. We've granted 31 shallow water permits going back to June when some additional requirements were first imposed. So we think that the pace of applications will increase as companies come to grips with and implement the new requirements that are imposed through our regulations. But we have very few that are pending. So I was just looking ahead, and in response to questions, well, when will the pace resume to a period where it was several years ago? For one thing, it was only a very relatively narrow slice of time where we were processing something like 15 permits a month. But well before Deepwater Horizon, the pace had substantially slowed down, in part due to economic conditions, in part due to other factors. So when I said never returning to the pace, I meant never returning to the pace where we were churning them out that quickly, because we did not have the set of requirements that we do now, nor the need to conduct the kind of environmental reviews that we do now. So it was not to be a statement of gloom and doom, but simply a reality. We have a new normal. It's going to take more time than it did in the past. It's not necessarily going to take a long time, but it's going to take more time.
Sorry, Director Bromwich, I have a question for you. The large-scale containment programs that have been proposed by Helix and by the group of majors, do you think that's going to be the solution for companies demonstrating their capability of controlling a well blowout, or do you think more company-specific programs are going to be necessary?
I'm very glad you asked that question because there's a lot of confusion about that. I think the Marine Well Containment Corporation and the Helix solution, for lack of a better term, are very important contributions to try to solve this containment issue. To be clear, though, we are not going to require that an operator in an application to drill pick one or the other or both. There may be new solutions that emerge. It may be that an operator can demonstrate that it has adequate containment abilities without calling upon either the MWCC or Helix. So I think both have made very significant contributions and have advanced the ball quite substantially, and that many operators will rely on one or the other or both. And so I think it's a very constructive development. It's been a little bit frustrating because we've been blamed for slowdowns in not issuing permits when the industry knows that the containment capabilities are not there yet. I think they will be there quite soon, but they haven't been there yet. So I think they are very important contributors to the solution, but there is absolutely no requirement that individual operators subscribe to one, subscribe to the other, or subscribe to both. It really depends on the characteristics and configuration of a particular well that they're applying to drill. You're welcome.
Earlier this week, the White House announced a major new initiative involving significant funding to promote offshore wind energy on the Atlantic coast. They said that responsibility for the initiative will be shared by the Department of Energy and the Department of Interior. Would you care to comment on the policy considerations behind this and tell us whether BOMER will be involved on behalf of DOI?
Yes, I'm glad you asked the question. Yes, the actual process of running the program relating to offshore wind is our responsibility. And so we have an office now that has just gotten off the ground in the last few years that has some very enthusiastic, very bright, very interested people, very interested in helping to stand up this new industry. And so we'll be very much involved in that. I think there has been some concern that we are leaving oil and gas behind in our agency and pushing forward with alternative and renewable energy. There are 1,100 people in my agency, and there are approximately 25 who are devoted to offshore wind. I would say that 97% of my time is spent on oil and gas issues and 3% on renewable. And that's not to say renewable is not important. It is. But for those who suggest that we're focusing on renewables and offshore wind because that's a regime change or a transition, obviously the country is not ready for that yet. And offshore wind is not sufficiently developed yet for anything like that. So we're excited about the initiative. We're excited about moving forward. We think we've figured out a way to expedite the permitting and application process. You think your guys takes long. Cape Wind, as you know, in Massachusetts took 10 years. And so one of the major pieces of the initiative was rolling out the designation of specific wind energy areas off the Atlantic that will allow us to move forward with respect to at least considering whether wind farms can be built with respect to those areas offshore. But it is still, unfortunately, farther away than some of us would like. It is an important piece of my agency's portfolio, but right now only a small piece.
Take the prerogative of last question. So there's been a lot of discussion in the media and from the Commission report about whether there aren't systemic problems in the industry. And I'd like to ask you, in thinking about the new regulations that have been put in place, and we had a discussion during our policy panel thinking of the role of government, do you think the regulations that have been put in place are sufficient to redress any kind of systemic problem? And do you see that as the role of government, or where do you see what industry needs to be doing?
Well, I addressed a lot of those issues in my speech. I think it's a shared responsibility. I think that government and the government regulator in particular had fallen way behind. And that's why we went forward. As you know, there was a report that Secretary Salazar submitted to the President in late May, drawing on some top-level engineers that helped formulate the recommendations. And that then became the core of the interim drilling safety rule that we put out in late September and early October. So what I think has happened is that has pushed us forward a very substantial way. And I've actually been quite heartened by my many discussions with people from industry about the efforts that they're making, both within established trade associations and in separate task forces, to really focus on safety issues, containment issues, and spill response issues with a focus that I don't think had been there in the same way previously. So I think that I'm heartened by that. I am very excited about what may become of the Ocean Energy Safety Institute. I think that's has terrific promise to bring government and industry together in the kind of dialogue and collaboration that will advance the goals of industry and advance the goals of the regulator and advance the goals of the American people. So I think it's going to continue to have to be a collaborative enterprise. We have a substantial role to play. Industry has a substantial role to play. I think the type and nature of the collaboration can be different. I think we've started to make it different, and I look forward to working with industry in pushing that forward. Thank you. Pleasure being here. Oh, we've got one more? We've got one more.
Can you make some comments with regard to when federal offshore leasing will begin again?
Sorry?
When federal offshore leasing will begin?
Well, I think Secretary Salazar and I have both said that we're hoping to have a lease sale before the end of 2011. We've got to do environmental reviews, and we've got a lot of work to do before then. So we're hopeful of having a lease sale by the end of 2011, and then there will be additional lease sales in early 2012. So that's the current program, and then after that, obviously, we go into the new 5-year plan, 2012 to 2017, where there's going to be a full menu of lease sales that are going to be planned.
Is the government differentiating between offshore shelf programs versus the deep water?
Not in that respect, no. Okay, thanks very much.